To start, I'll create a new layer on top of the lay-in and call it base tone. I like to work on separate layers because it allows me to make changes to the drawing more easily. But you can just draw on a single layer if you want to. And of course, if you're working traditionally, then you don't have to worry about all this layers business. Next, I'll lower the opacity of my brush and make the brush size a lot bigger. And we're just going to fill in the shadow side of the drawing with an even light base tone. As you can see, by making the brush size bigger, we're able to fill in this area much more quickly. If you're working traditionally, just use the side of your pencil to shade more broadly and use less pressure to create a lighter tone. If you're having trouble maintaining a light pressure, you can just switch to a harder pencil like a 2H, which will help keep your marks very light. Once the base tone is set, we can add in the hatching. I'll create a new layer and call it hatching. Then I'll return the brush opacity and size back to normal. I'll start by putting in dark hatch lines in the opening of the nostril just to fill them in. Next, I'll fill in the cast shadow under the nose. I'm going in this diagonal direction because I feel like that flows with the shape of the shadow the best, but you can play around with other directions as well. The most important thing is to keep the spacing between the lines consistent. By the way, if you enjoyed this lesson, be sure to check out the full nose drawing course at mydrawingtutorials.com/nose. It will dive way deeper into the subject and teach you everything you need to draw realistic and dynamic noses. Okay, back to the lesson. Next, we'll fill in the underplane of the nostril. Notice how I'm changing the direction of the lines as I go around the nostril. I find that this has a nice flow to it, and it makes the hatch lines look like they're curling into the nostril. For this middle plane, I'll have the lines going horizontally across. So the basic idea here is that we're using these hatch lines to not only fill in the shadow areas, but also to distinguish between the planes of the nose and describe the form. For these upper planes, the lines will go across the wings, and then climb up the sides, and then across the ball of the nose. You might recall that this is exactly like the cross-contour line that we drew across the nose in the planes lesson. These hatch lines we're drawing are basically just stylized cross-contour lines that helps describe the form. For the bridge of the nose, I'll have these lines climb up the sides of the bridge, and then they'll slope down towards the face like so. Knowing how to design these hatch lines can be really hard because there are so many possibilities. And as you can see, I will test out different designs, and if I don't like it, I'll just erase it and try again. As you do this more and more, you'll develop a sense for what will look good. You can also study the works of other artists whose cross-hatching style you like. I like to go on Pinterest.com and collect a bunch of cross-hatching drawings that I like, and then copy them as study exercises. Then I'll try to incorporate that style into my own drawing. Okay, now that we've filled in the main shadow areas, we can move on into the halftone. So I'll start by continuing the hatch lines that were climbing up the side of the bridge and have them curl over and across the front plane of the bridge. This will help to convey the roundness of the bridge. We want to keep the hatch lines in this area more subtle, so you'll want to keep a light pressure with your pencil. If you're having trouble doing that, you can always reduce the opacity of your brush. And if you're working traditionally, you can switch to a harder lead pencil like a 2H. Then I'll go back over portions of these lines to make them darker. The idea is to accentuate the core shadow that separates the light and the dark. Next, I'll add some very light hatch lines along the bright side of the nose. Again, since this side is hit by the light, we want to keep our hatch lines extremely subtle. But we do want to use the hatch lines to convey that this portion of the nose is protruding out from the face. Okay, so that should do it for this round of hatching. Next, I'll put in the highlights. I'll create a new layer and call it Highlight. I'll keep the brush opacity at around 50% because I want the highlights to be more subtle. And I'll switch the brush color to white. If you're working traditionally, you can simply switch to a white charcoal pencil or some other white pencil. Let's start with the obvious highlight at the tip of the nose. And there's a more subtle highlight on the left side as well. Since his greater ala cartilage is separated into two parts, the peak on each side is being hit by the light more, creating these highlights. And because the light is coming from the right side of the nose has a more intense highlight. As you can see, as soon as we put in these highlights, the tip of the nose immediately looks more rounded. Next, there's another highlight on the side of the wings, where a second light source is hitting the face. I'll add a much more subtle highlight on this side as well. Then I'll add some highlight to the right side of the bridge. Notice how even with the highlights, I'm still using cross-contouring hatch lines to help describe the form of the nose. The hatch lines are following the same patterns as the shadow side, except we're just using a white pencil instead. I'm also going to go over these lines a second time to darken the portion of the bridge that's protruding out the most. And I'll also add just a few light lines going in the vertical direction, just to give the corner of the bridge a little bit more definition. Next, we'll put in some highlights around the nose. This area is getting a lot of light, so it's quite bright. Here, as I'm designing these hatch lines, I tried to keep some principles in mind. For one, I tried to vary up the length of the lines. Don't make all the lines the same length because that will look boring. But don't just randomly vary up the length because that will look chaotic. Instead, have a pattern to how the length changes. For example, if I start out with a long line, then I'll make the next line slightly shorter so that all the lines gradually tapers to a point. And if I start out with a short line, I'll make the next one slightly longer and so forth. That way your design will seem intentional. Also, I try to vary up the direction of the lines and the shape that they form. For example, if I have a triangular patch of horizontal lines, then next to it I'll try to put a rectangular patch of diagonal lines to mix things up. Think of these patches of lines as puzzle pieces, and you're trying to fit them together in a way that looks interesting. Okay, so that's pretty much all the elements of this drawing. The nose looks pretty realistic, and honestly, we can just stop right here if we wanted to. Now, if we wanted to bring it to a higher level of finish, it's just a matter of repeating the process we went through and refining the details. So I'll go back to the base tone layer, switch the brush color back to blue, and increase the brush size. And I'll work on the halftone area to create a smoother transition between the light and the shadow. I'll also add some value to the shadow side to increase the contrast. This will help to make the light side appear more brilliant and give the drawing a more dramatic effect. As you can see, the more tonal value I add in, the subtler the hatch lines become. That's a balance that you can play with. Do you want your drawing to be more tonal and realistic? In which case, you would make the tones darker. Or do you want the drawing to be more linear and stylized? In which case, you would keep the tones lighter so that the hatch lines could shine through. Also, let's work on the halftone area in the light side as well. Again, the goal here is to just smooth out the transition between light and dark. The hatch lines are helping to describe the form and add energy to the drawing. And the tonal shading is helping to smooth out the transitions and make the drawing more realistic. And there's a little bit of subtle halftone that goes down the center of the tip to create the separation between the ala cartilages. So we'll put that in as well. Be careful not to overdo this part. Okay, next I'll go back to the hatching layers and add in more subtle hatch lines. I'll add some curving hatch lines along the edge of the shadow at the tip. This helps to better define the core shadow and also stylize the drawing a bit. Next, I'll also emphasize the core shadow along the bottom plane of the wings with these short hatch lines. You'll notice that emphasizing core shadows will be a repeating theme in my drawing. I find that this is a really easy way to make a drawing more realistic and dynamic. Next, I'm going to switch to a soft edge eraser. I'll lower the opacity way down. And I'll make the size really big. If you're working traditionally, you can just use a kneaded eraser for this. And I'm going to just go around the drawing and lighten the edges so that everything gradually fades out. This helps to create a vignette effect that makes the drawing look more attractive. If you're working digitally on multiple layers, you might have to click back and forth between the layers to make sure that you erase across all of them, which can be a bit of a hassle. So that is one benefit to just working on a single layer or drawing traditionally. But overall, I still find that the benefit of working on multiple layers outweighs the con. We can also use the eraser to lightly knock back any areas that we feel is too intense. So I'll use it on the highlights in the bridge of the nose to make them more subtle and gradually fade out. And lastly, I'll just add some finishing touches to the highlight areas around the edge of the nose. I'll make the area closest to the nose slightly brighter in order to emphasize how the tone gradually fades out as we get further away. Okay, so that's it for our front view nose. To recap, we started by lightly sketching in the simplified nose and rhythm lines, which serve as the foundation for a more detailed lay-in. Then we added in a layer of base tone to separate the light and shadow. After that, we added in the hatch lines to further describe the form and stylize the drawing. And lastly, we added in the highlights to describe the light side of the nose. Okay, so go ahead and try this exercise for yourself, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and if you did, make sure to check out the full nose drawing course at mydrawingtutorials.com/nose. You'll get hours of additional lessons and step-by-step exercises, and learn things like how to draw and shade the nose from a bunch of different angles, how to exaggerate your reference and draw stylized or cartoonish noses, how to draw noses from your imagination, and a whole lot more. So if you're ready to improve your nose drawing skills, head over to mydrawingtutorials.com/nose or click the link below.